There is a forest in Tanzania where between 1974 and 1978, one group of chimpanzees systematically killed every member of a neighboring group. Not in a single battle, not in a confrontation that got out of hand. Over 4 years, in a series of calculated raids carried out by groups of males moving in near silence to the edges of their territory and beyond, they hunted down and killed, one by one, the animals that had once been members of their own community. By the end of it, the neighboring group no longer existed. Their range had been absorbed, their females had been taken, their males were dead. The researchers watching this happen at the Gombe Stream Research Center in Tanzania had spent years building a picture of chimpanzee life that emphasized family bonds, tool use, intelligence, and social warmth. What they watched between 1974 and 1978 required them to revise that picture in ways that some of them found genuinely disturbing, not just professionally but personally, because the animals committing the violence were animals they knew by name, animals they had watched since infancy, animals whose individual personalities and social relationships they had documented across years of careful observation. Jane Goodall, who had been at Gombe since 1960 and who knew the animals involved better than anyone, wrote later that the experience shook her faith in the idea that humans were uniquely capable of organized cruelty. The chimpanzees were not acting in ways that looked, from the outside, like animal aggression. They were acting in ways that looked like something else. Subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment right now telling us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. We want to know. The chimpanzee is our closest living relative. It shares more than 98% of its DNA with humans, which is closer to us than a horse is to a zebra. When researchers talk about the chimpanzee, they are not talking about a distant cousin whose behavior has only passing relevance to our own. They are talking about an animal whose cognitive architecture, social structure, and behavioral repertoire overlap with ours enough that what the chimpanzee does in the forest is genuinely informative about what we are capable of and why. The violence is part of that picture. It is not the whole picture, but it is a part that cannot be explained away, and understanding it is one of the most important things that 50 years of chimpanzee research has produced. The aggression of chimpanzees operates at 2 levels that are worth distinguishing from each other because they have different causes, different functions, and different implications. The first is within-group aggression, the constant low-level violence that maintains the hierarchy inside a chimpanzee community. The second is between-group aggression, the organized lethal violence that the Gombe War exemplified. Both are real, both are significant, and both are driven by the same underlying force, which is competition for resources expressed through a cognitive system sophisticated enough to plan, coordinate, and execute violence over extended periods. Within a chimpanzee community, the social hierarchy is maintained through a continuous process of enforcement that involves displays, threats, chases, and physical attacks. The dominant male, the alpha, does not simply occupy his position by virtue of being the strongest individual. He occupies it by constantly asserting his dominance over other males, through displays that involve charging, throwing objects, and producing the loud vocalizations that announce his presence to the entire group. Other males respond to these displays by crouching, presenting their hindquarters in submission, and producing the specific pant-grunt call that signals deference. The exchange is not occasional. It is continuous, woven into the daily fabric of life in a chimpanzee community, a constant renegotiation of status that never fully resolves and that is never fully settled. The violence that enforces this hierarchy can be severe. Adult male chimpanzees have been documented breaking each other's bones, tearing off fingers and toes, and inflicting wounds that in some cases have been fatal. The attacks are not limited to males. Adult males attack females, sometimes seriously, in contexts that appear to be related to reproductive control, with males attacking females who associate with rival males or who fail to show appropriate deference. And males sometimes attack infants, particularly infants fathered by rivals, in acts of infanticide that eliminate a competitor's offspring while simultaneously bringing the female back into reproductive cycling. making her available to the infanticidal male sooner than she would otherwise have been. The infanticide is worth dwelling on because it is one of the aspects of chimpanzee behavior that was most resistant to acceptance when it was first documented. The initial reaction from some researchers was to treat it as aberrant, as the behavior of disturbed individuals, or as an artifact of the specific conditions at the Gombe site. The accumulation of data from multiple sites across multiple decades made this interpretation impossible to sustain. Infanticide in chimpanzees is a widespread, consistent pattern that has been documented in nearly every population studied in sufficient depth. It is not aberrant, it is a reproductive strategy, one that is costly to the females whose infants are killed and advantageous to the males who do the killing, and one that has been maintained across the species by the same evolutionary logic that maintains every other behavior that produces reproductive benefits despite its costs. The specific events of the Gombe War, which researchers came to call the 4 Years' War, unfolded with a logic that was difficult to deny once the full sequence had been documented. The community that conducted the raids had originally been a single large group that split in 1971 into a northern group, which retained the original core range, and a southern group, the Kahama community, which established itself in the southern portion of the former range. The split had appeared, at the time it happened, to be a relatively ordinary social fission of the kind that chimpanzee communities undergo when they grow large enough that the social management of a single group becomes difficult. What it was, in retrospect, was the creation of two competing groups from one, and the northern group's subsequent behavior toward the southern one followed the logic of intergroup competition with a consistency and a completeness that left no room for alternative interpretations. Every adult male in the Kahama community was killed. Most of the females were taken into the northern group. The youngest Kahama infant was killed. The southern range was incorporated into the northern community's territory. The war had an outcome that was, by any reasonable definition of the word, a victory. The role of females in chimpanzee violence is more complex than a focus on the raiding males might suggest, and it is worth examining because it reveals something important about how aggression is embedded in chimpanzee social life at every level, not just in the spectacular violence of intergroup raids. Within the community, adult females have their own hierarchy, which they maintain through the same combination of displays, threats, and physical attacks that characterizes male hierarchy management, though typically at lower intensity. Female chimpanzees attack other females, particularly around food and around their infants. They form coalitions with other females that shift over time in ways that reflect changing alliances and interests, and they are not passive observers of male violence. There are documented cases of female chimpanzees participating in attacks on infants from other communities, and of females directing aggression toward the infants of rivals within their own community. The violence of chimpanzee social life is not a male phenomenon with female bystanders. It is a property of the social system as a whole. The stress hormones of chimpanzees tell a complementary story to the behavioral record. Researchers who have measured cortisol levels in wild chimpanzees have found that the animals at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy carry elevated stress hormone levels as a chronic condition, not just in acute conflict situations, but as a baseline state that reflects their position in the social order. The males who are most frequently threatened, most often displaced from food, and least able to access mating opportunities, carry the physiological signature of chronic stress in their bodies at all times. The social hierarchy is not just a behavioral arrangement. It is a medical condition for the animals at its lower end, one that has measurable effects on immune function, reproductive success, and longevity. Low-ranking chimpanzees live shorter lives than high-ranking ones, and the physiological mechanism connecting rank to lifespan runs through the chronic stress that the hierarchy imposes on the animals least able to manage it. The between-group violence is different in character from the within-group violence, and the difference is illuminating. Within the community, the aggression is regulated. It is constrained by the social relationships that hold the group together, by the knowledge that today's target of aggression is tomorrow's potential ally, and by the reconciliation behaviors that repair relationships after conflicts. Between groups, none of these constraints apply. The animal encountered on a border patrol is not a community member whose relationship to the attacker has history and future. It is a competitor, a threat to the group's resources, and in the specific context of a raiding party moving in silence beyond the home range boundary, it is a target. The patrols themselves are one of the most striking behaviors in the chimpanzee behavioral repertoire. Groups of adult males, sometimes a dozen or more, move to the boundaries of their territory and beyond in a coordinated silent formation that is qualitatively different from their normal movement. They stop frequently and listen. They avoid making calls. They move in a way that experienced field researchers describe as unmistakably purposeful, as though the group has a shared objective and is managing its own behavior to serve that objective. When they detect signs of a neighboring group, they assess the situation. If the neighbors are numerous or close to their own range, the patrol usually retreats. If the neighbors are alone or in small numbers, far from the safety of their core range, what happens next is what the Gombe data documented in its most complete form. The attack on a lone or isolated individual typically involves multiple attackers, which means the victim has no possibility of defending itself effectively against the full force of what is brought against it. The attackers bite, hit, drag, and in some cases deliberately injure specific body parts, breaking limbs, tearing wounds that will be debilitating, even if they are not immediately fatal. The attacks are prolonged. They end when the victim is dead or so severely injured that it cannot survive independently. And then the patrol returns home, along the same routes they came in the same near silence they maintained throughout. What the data from Ngogo in Uganda, where the most extensive long-term patrol study has been conducted, shows is that this behavior is not occasional or random. Patrols happen regularly, multiple times per month. The males who participate in patrols do so consistently across years. The territory gained by communities that conduct more patrols and kill more neighbors accumulates over time. The relationship between patrol intensity and territorial expansion is direct and measurable. The chimpanzee community is, by the standards of any definition that matters, waging war, not metaphorically. In the specific sense that involves organized, coordinated, lethal violence between groups directed at territorial gain over extended periods. The question of what triggers the transition from a patrol that retreats to a patrol that attacks has been studied carefully, and the answer is primarily numerical. Chimpanzees assess the size of the opposition before committing to an attack, and the threshold for attacking rather than retreating appears to be roughly a 3-to-1 numerical advantage in favor of the attacking group. Lone individuals encountered during a patrol are almost always attacked. Pairs are usually attacked. Groups of 3 or more are usually avoided unless the patrol is large enough to maintain the advantage. This numerical sensitivity implies a capacity for rapid quantity assessment that is more sophisticated than a simple fight-or-flight reflex, and that is consistent with the broader cognitive picture of chimpanzee intelligence. The patrol is not just moving through the forest and attacking whatever it finds. It is evaluating what it finds against a threshold and making a behavioral decision based on that evaluation. The decision is made quickly, in the field, under conditions where error in either direction has costs. Getting the assessment wrong toward underconfidence means retreating from an attack that would have succeeded. Getting it wrong toward overconfidence means committing to an attack that the opposition can repel. The animals get it right most of the time. The hunting behavior of chimpanzees, which targets colobus monkeys and occasionally other primates, adds another dimension to the picture of chimpanzee aggression that is sometimes treated separately from the intergroup violence, but that reflects the same underlying capabilities. Chimpanzee hunts are coordinated, with different individuals taking different positions to cut off escape routes, and the coordination improves with experience and with the specific composition of the hunting group. The meat from a successful hunt is distributed in ways that reflect social relationships and hierarchical position, with high-ranking males receiving larger shares and using the distribution of meat as a social currency, giving to allies and withholding from rivals. The hunting behavior is not separate from the social politics of the chimpanzee community. It is embedded in it, another arena in which the same forces of competition, alliance, and calculated advantage that drive the hierarchy play out in a form that involves the killing of other animals. The reconciliation that follows within group aggression in chimpanzees is one of the most studied aspects of their social behavior and is worth examining because it illuminates the function of the violence rather than simply its existence. After an aggressive interaction between two community members, particularly between animals with close social bonds, reconciliation behavior typically occurs within minutes to hours. The two animals approach each other, make physical contact through touching, grooming, or kissing, and resume normal social interaction. The stress hormones of both animals, measurable in their urine, return to baseline levels faster after a reconciliation than after interactions where reconciliation does not occur. The violence in this context is not a breakdown of the social relationship. It is part of how the social relationship is maintained, a mechanism for enforcing norms and resolving disputes that the relationship can contain and absorb because the reconciliation follows. This is a sophisticated social system, one that uses aggression instrumentally and that has built-in mechanisms for repairing the damage that aggression causes. The sophistication of the system does not reduce the reality of the violence. It reveals the violence as functional rather than random, which is in some ways more unsettling than random violence would be. The implications of this for the study of human violence have been debated extensively since the Gombe data first became available, and the debate has not been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The argument that human warfare has deep evolutionary roots, shared with our common ancestor with chimpanzees, is supported by the structural similarities between chimpanzee intergroup violence and human warfare. The counter-argument that the ecological conditions producing chimpanzee violence are specific enough that the parallel to human warfare is misleading has also found serious support. What is not in dispute is that the behavior is real, that it is widespread across chimpanzee populations studied in sufficient depth, and that it cannot be explained as a response to human disturbance or as an artifact of provisioning at research sites, which was an early and persistent objection that the data has since largely refuted. The chimpanzee is not simply aggressive, it is intelligently aggressive in ways that require planning, coordination, assessment of risk and opportunity, and sustained effort toward a goal over time. The same cognitive architecture that produces the tool use and the social learning and the cultural transmission that make chimpanzees remarkable also produces the patrol behavior and the calculated violence. These are not separate aspects of the chimpanzee, they are expressions of the same mind, directed at different problems. When the problem is a competing group of chimpanzees in a resource-constrained landscape, what the chimpanzee mind produces is war. And it has been producing it in the forests of Africa long before there were researchers to watch it happen or names to give it. The fear that chimpanzee communities show toward neighboring groups, the alarm calls, the rapid retreats toward the center of the home range when signs of neighbors are detected, the protective clustering around vulnerable individuals when a patrol is suspected nearby, is the behavioral index of what between-group violence costs the animals it is directed at. The females who lose infants to infanticide and who carry the behavioral and physiological sequelae of those losses for months afterward. The males who have survived attacks that left them permanently injured. The juveniles who grow up in communities that spend significant portions of their behavioral budget managing the threat of neighboring groups. The violence is not free, even for the animals doing it. It is paid for in vigilance and in stress, and in the constant background awareness of a world that contains, beyond the boundary of the home range, animals that will kill you if the situation allows. This is the life the chimpanzee leads. It is not the whole life, but it is a real and substantial part of it, and it is the part that 50 years of careful research has made impossible to look away from. The population-level consequences of chimpanzee intergroup violence are visible in the long-term demographic data from research sites that have been continuously monitored for decades. Communities that have expanded their range through successful raiding show higher reproductive success. In the years following the expansion, as access to more food-bearing territory translates into better condition for females and higher infant survival rates. Communities that have been on the losing end of territorial disputes show the opposite pattern: reduced female condition, higher infant mortality, and in some cases dissolution of the community as females transfer out and males lose their ability to maintain cohesion. The violence is not ecologically neutral. It produces real demographic outcomes that persist over years and that shape the long-term structure of the chimpanzee population in a given area. The communities that are most aggressive in the context of intergroup competition are the communities that grow. The communities that are least aggressive, or that are unlucky in the composition of their male coalition, are the communities that shrink and sometimes disappear. What the Ngogo chimpanzee community in Uganda demonstrated most clearly over the decades of study that researchers from multiple institutions have contributed to is that the 4 years war at Gombe was not an isolated incident at a single site under unusual conditions. Ngogo, which has one of the largest and most thoroughly studied chimpanzee communities in the world, conducted a sustained campaign of intergroup violence between 1999 and 2008 that resulted in the killing of 18 individuals from neighboring groups and the annexation of a significant territory to the north of the community's core range. The pattern was the same as Gombe: coordinated patrols, targeted attacks on isolated individuals, accumulated kills over years, territorial expansion as the outcome. The researchers who documented this were not surprised by what they found because the Gombe data had prepared them. But the scale and the duration of the Ngogo campaign added a level of statistical confidence to the intergroup violence picture that the single-site data from Gombe could not provide on its own. The behavior was not an artifact of Gombe, it was a property of the species. The alpha male's position in a chimpanzee community is maintained not just through his own aggression, but through a network of alliances with other males that he has built and maintains through social investment, grooming, sharing food, and supporting allies in their own conflicts. When that alliance network collapses, the alpha falls, usually not to a single stronger male, but to a coalition of 2 or 3 males who have decided that working together against the alpha is more advantageous than working for him. The deposed alpha does not simply disappear from the community. He drops in rank, becomes a target for the aggression he previously directed at others, and in some cases is seriously injured by the males who have taken his position. The politics of chimpanzee society are not gentle, and they are not kind to those who lose. The same intelligence that builds the alliance that takes down an alpha also runs the calculation about what to do with an alpha once he has been taken down, and the calculation does not reliably produce mercy. The young male chimpanzee's path into the violence of adult community life begins earlier than the dramatic raids would suggest. From around the age of 8 or 9, when they are still physically immature but socially ambitious, young males begin the process of testing and asserting their position in the hierarchy, first against other young males, then against adult females, and eventually, as they approach physical maturity in their mid-teens, against adult males. The violence of these early assertions is real, though it rarely results in the severe injuries that adult male conflicts can produce. What it does produce is practice, the development of the behavioral repertoire for conflict, the experience of winning and losing, and the accumulated social information about who is a reliable ally and who is not. By the time a male chimpanzee enters his prime years in his late teens and 20s, the aggression that the community will see from him has been years in development. It is not impulsive. It is the expression of a social strategy that has been building since childhood. The comparison between chimpanzee violence and human violence is one that the scientific community approaches carefully because the implications are significant in both directions. If chimpanzee intergroup violence is genuinely analogous to human warfare, then human warfare has roots that go back at least 6 million years to the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans, which implies that the capacity for organized lethal aggression between groups is not a product of human culture or human institutions, but a biological inheritance that predates both. If the analogy is misleading, then the origins of human warfare remain more open, potentially rooted in the specific conditions of human social and cultural evolution rather than in a deep biological predisposition. The data from chimpanzees does not resolve this debate. It constrains it. It shows that an animal this close to us, in an environment not shaped by the specific factors that critics have proposed as alternative explanations, engages in organized lethal raiding that produces territorial gain over time. What that means for the story of human violence is a question that the chimpanzee data forces, but does not answer. The chimpanzee is not the only primate that engages in within-group and between-group violence. As the next 3 parts of this series will show, aggression is woven into the social fabric of primate life across species, in ways that vary in form and intensity, but that reflect a common underlying dynamic. Competition for reproductive resources in a social setting where other members of the same species are simultaneously the most important allies and the most significant competitors. The chimpanzee is the extreme end of this dynamic among the great apes, the species in which the violence is most organized, most sustained, and most consequential for the animals it involves. What makes the chimpanzee the right place to start this series is not that its violence is the most dramatic, though it is dramatic. It is that the chimpanzee makes the connection between intelligence and aggression most clear. The same mind that produces the tool use and the cultural transmission and the political alliance building also produces the patrol and the raid and the 4-year war. The violence and the intelligence are not in tension. They are expressions of the same cognitive system. And that system is what the next 3 parts will find, in different forms, in 3 more of our closest relatives. The documentary record of chimpanzee violence that has accumulated over 50 years of continuous research at sites like Gombe, Mahale, Ngogo, Bosu, and Tai is large enough now to support conclusions with a statistical confidence that early single-site studies could not provide. The meta-analysis of intergroup killing rates across multiple study populations found that the rate of lethal aggression in chimpanzees, when adjusted for the amount of time populations have been observed and the number of individuals in each study group, is significantly higher than had been appreciated from individual site studies alone. The behavior is not rare. It is not concentrated at a single aberrant location. It is a consistent feature of chimpanzee social life across the range of environments and ecological conditions in which the species has been systematically observed. The chimpanzee is, by any reasonable standard of comparison, a violent animal. It is also, by any reasonable standard of comparison, a cognitively sophisticated, socially rich, emotionally complex animal. The 2 things are true simultaneously, and the chimpanzee research has forced us to hold both at once. The forest at Gombe today still contains chimpanzees. The community that conducted the 4 years' war and won it is long past, replaced by generations of animals who have no direct memory of what happened between 1974 and 1978. The boundary between what was once the Kasekela community's range and what was once the Kahama community's range is no longer marked by anything visible. The forest grew back over it, and the current animals range through it with the calm of animals inhabiting a world that is simply the world, without the history that the researchers reading the old field notes carry for them. Somewhere in that forest tonight, males are moving toward the edges of their territory, or resting after a patrol, or grooming allies whose support they will need in whatever comes next. The violence that the species is capable of is not displayed in every moment. Most moments are ordinary, but the capacity is there, built into the social structure and the cognitive architecture, waiting for the conditions that will call it out. It has been waiting in the forests of Africa, since long before there were researchers to give it a name. The specific form that chimpanzee aggression takes in the context of male reproductive competition, outside of the territory raids, includes behaviors that were documented at multiple sites, but that took time to fully understand. Adult males have been observed monitoring the reproductive state of females in their community with a precision that reflects sustained attention over weeks and months, tracking which females are in the fertile phase of their cycle and directing significantly more social investment, grooming, and food sharing toward those females during those periods. The same males have been documented attacking females who associate with rival males during fertile periods, in what researchers have interpreted as a form of mate guarding through aggression. The connection between sexual competition and violence in chimpanzees is not a simple one-to-one relationship. It is embedded in a social system where access to fertile females is one of the primary goods that hierarchical position controls, and where aggression at every level, from the daily assertion of rank to the intergroup raid, contributes to or detracts from an individual's access to that good. The violence makes sense, in evolutionary terms, precisely because it works. The animals that engage in it successfully leave more offspring than those that do not. The offspring carry the same tendencies. The cycle continues. What the first part of this series has established is the baseline against which the next three parts can be measured. The chimpanzee represents the high end of primate violence in terms of organization, lethality, and the sophistication of the social system that produces and contains it. The orangutan, the gorilla, and the baboon that follow are not simply lesser versions of the chimpanzee. They have their own forms of aggression, shaped by their own social structures, their own ecological pressures, and their own evolutionary histories. What they share with the chimpanzee and with each other is the same fundamental dynamic: competition for resources in a social setting, expressed through a primate brain capable of planning, remembering, and calculating advantage. The forms the violence takes vary. The engine that produces it does not. The orangutan does not look like a violent animal. It moves slowly through the canopy of Borneo and Sumatra, with the deliberate, almost meditative pace of an animal that has all the time in the world. It is solitary in a way that no other great ape is solitary, spending most of its life without the company of others of its kind, ranging through a home territory that overlaps with other individuals, but that rarely produces the sustained social interactions that chimpanzee or gorilla life centers on. It eats fruit, mostly, and leaves and bark and insects, working through the canopy systematically with large, dexterous hands that are capable of extraordinary delicacy. It is intelligent, deeply so, with a tool-using repertoire and a problem-solving capacity that has impressed researchers for decades. It looks, from a distance, like peace. The distance is misleading. The orangutan has a form of violence embedded in its reproductive biology that is, by some measures, more disturbing than the organized warfare of the chimpanzee, because it is not between groups. It is within the species, between males, and it is directed at females in a way that the scientific literature spent years trying to describe accurately, without either minimizing what was documented or overclaiming what the behavior meant. What it documented was this: forced copulation, occurring at rates that vary by population and by the male type doing it, but that are real and measurable in the behavioral record of every orangutan population that has been studied in sufficient depth. Subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment right now telling us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. Those comments mean a lot to us. The orangutan has a social system unlike that of any other great ape, and understanding the violence requires understanding the system that produces it. Adult male orangutans exist in two distinct forms, a phenomenon called bimorphism that is unusual enough in primates to have attracted significant research attention. The first form is the flanged male, the animal most people picture when they think of an adult male orangutan, large, sometimes twice the weight of a female, with the distinctive cheek pads that expand outward from the face like rounded flanges of fatty tissue, a throat pouch that produces the long call, a deep resonant vocalization that carries for kilometers through the forest, and a behavioral repertoire that includes active territory defense and direct competition with other flanged males for access to females. The second form is the unflanged male, physically smaller, without the cheek pads or the throat pouch, resembling a large female in body shape, but sexually mature and capable of reproduction. The two male types are not young and old versions of the same animal, though that is what was initially assumed when the bimorphism was first described. They are alternative male strategies, both capable of reproduction, that can coexist in the same population for years. An unflanged male can remain in that state for his entire life, never developing the flanges and the long call that characterize the flanged male if the social conditions do not favor the transition. or he can develop flanges rapidly when a dominant flanged male disappears from his range, transforming within months into the fully flanged form. The transition is triggered by social conditions rather than by age alone, which means that the unflanged state is a plastic strategy rather than an immature one. The reproductive strategies of the two male types are different in ways that matter for understanding the violence. Flanged males attract females through the long call, which advertises their presence and their quality to females over large distances, and through direct courtship of females they encounter. Female orangutans, who are rare and widely distributed in the forest, preferentially associate with flanged males and preferentially mate with them when given the choice. The flanged male's strategy is one of honest advertisement and female choice, in which the male's quality is signaled reliably by the flanges and the long call, and the females assess those signals and respond accordingly. The unflanged male's strategy is different. He does not have the long call. He does not have the cheek pads. He cannot compete with a flanged male for female preference through the same channels. What he can do, and what the behavioral data documents him doing at significant rates across studied populations, is force copulation. He approaches females, sometimes after a chase that can cover hundreds of meters through the canopy, and mates with them despite their active resistance. The females resist. They vocalize in distress. They attempt to flee. They fight back physically. The unflanged male, who is substantially larger than a female even without the flanged male's extreme size, overcomes this resistance by force. The documentation of this behavior in the scientific literature required researchers to describe what they were observing with a precision that did not minimize it. Early accounts used language that was criticized by some for being insufficiently direct about what was being described. Later accounts used more explicit language: forced copulation, sexual coercion, non-consensual mating. The terms were contested not because the behavior was contested, but because the application of concepts from human ethics to animal behavior is a philosophically complicated matter. What was not contested was what the cameras recorded and what the researchers observing it wrote in their field notes. The behavior was real, it was widespread, and it was a consistent feature of unflanged male reproductive strategy. The female orangutan's response to the two male types reveals something important about how sexual coercion and female choice interact in this species. When a flanged male is present and accessible, females actively seek him out, following the direction of his long call, visiting him and initiating mating with him in ways that leave no ambiguity about preference. When unflanged males are present, females avoid them, retreat from them, and resist their approaches actively. The behavioral asymmetry is sharp and consistent. It is not that females are indifferent between the two male types. They have a clear preference, and they express it whenever the conditions allow them to act on it. What the forced copulation by unflanged males represents is a circumvention of that preference through physical force, a reproductive outcome that the female's behavior makes clear she would not choose if she had the option of avoiding it. The distinction matters for understanding what the behavior is and for understanding what it costs the females who experience it. The developmental trajectory from unflanged to flanged male is one of the most remarkable life history patterns in the primate order. An unflanged male can remain in that state for years, even decades, sexually mature, but developmentally arrested at a form that does not broadcast his maturity to rivals. The trigger for the developmental transition to the flanged state appears to be primarily social. The disappearance of the dominant flanged male in the range, whether through death, displacement, or long absence, creates conditions under which the developmental suppression is released and the unflanged male undergoes a relatively rapid transition, developing cheek pads, increasing dramatically in body mass, and beginning to produce the long call within a period of months. The physiological mechanism underlying this socially gated development involves testosterone and other hormones, whose levels are suppressed in the presence of a dominant flanged male and released when that dominance signal is removed. The unflanged male is not waiting to grow up. He is waiting for an opportunity, and his body is ready to respond to it when it arrives. The long call of the flanged male deserves more detailed treatment because it is one of the most acoustically complex vocalizations produced by any non-human primate, and because understanding it illuminates the function of the flanges and the throat pouch that produce it. The call can last for several minutes. It begins with a series of low, grumbling sounds that build gradually into a full-volume roar, then subsides into long, resonant bubbling sounds produced by air being expelled through the throat pouch, and finally fades into a series of quieter pulses. The total acoustic energy produced is enormous, enough to carry through kilometers of dense forest. Other males who hear it receive information about the caller's size, his health, and his location, and they respond by altering their own movement patterns to avoid or to approach depending on their own competitive assessment of the situation. Females who hear it move toward its source if they are in a receptive state and if no closer flanged male is available. The long call is a broadcasting system for reproductive status, a public announcement that is heard simultaneously by competitors and by potential mates, and that produces different behavioral responses in each. The evolutionary logic of forced copulation in orangutans is the same logic that underlies every reproductive strategy that has been maintained over evolutionary time. It works. Unflanged males do sire offspring. The rate is lower than flanged males achieve through preferred mating, but it is not zero, and the cumulative reproductive success of unflanged males across their lifetimes contributes meaningfully to the next generation's gene pool. The strategy has been maintained by evolution because the genes of unflanged males who used it were represented in the offspring they produced. This is not a justification, it is an explanation, and the distinction matters. Understanding why a behavior exists in evolutionary terms is not the same as endorsing it. It is the prerequisite for understanding the animal that produces it. The flanged male's violence, while different in form from the unflanged male's, is no less real. Flanged males compete with each other for territory and for access to females in ways that can produce serious injuries. The long call is partly a territorial announcement, a signal to other flanged males about the caller's presence and size, and flanged males that encounter each other in overlapping ranges may engage in direct physical confrontations that involve biting, grappling, and sustained struggles between very large animals. The cheek pads that give flanged males their distinctive appearance may function partly as protection in these confrontations, cushioning the blows to the face that rival males direct. The scars on the faces and hands of wild flanged males, visible to researchers who observe them over years, are the record of these encounters. The animal that looks peaceful in the canopy is carrying the evidence of violence in its skin. The infanticide that is documented in some orangutan populations adds another dimension to the picture. Male orangutans have been observed killing infants, and the pattern of these killings is consistent with what has been documented in chimpanzees and in other primate species. The victims are typically infants, not fathered by the infanticidal male, and the mothers of killed infants return to reproductive cycling faster than they would if the infant had survived, making them available to the infanticidal male sooner. The behavior has been documented less frequently in orangutans than in chimpanzees, partly because orangutan densities are lower and the behavior is therefore harder to observe, and partly because the solitary nature of orangutan life means that the opportunities for infanticide are structured differently. But where it has been documented, it follows the same reproductive logic. Killing a rival's offspring is a reproductive investment in future offspring of one's own. The solitary life of the orangutan, which sets it apart from the other great apes, is itself partly a product of the competitive dynamics between males. Flanged male orangutans maintain large territories that they actively defend against other flanged males, and the distances between males in a wild population reflect both the density of the food resources that support them and the social pressure that male competition creates. A territory that is large enough to support a flanged male and to give him preferential access to the females within it is a territory that other flanged males are attempting to enter or to hold adjacent to. The long call is not just an advertisement to females. It is a warning to rival males, a declaration of presence and of size that other males hear and assess before deciding whether to approach or to avoid. The landscape of sound in an orangutan forest is a map of male competition, each long call marking the position of a competitor and announcing to everyone within range the cost of challenging him. The ecological pressure that underlies all of this aggression is worth naming directly, because it connects the orangutan's violence to the same fundamental dynamic that drives primate aggression across species. Fruit in the forests of Borneo and Sumatra is not evenly distributed. It comes in pulses, with individual trees fruiting at different times and in different abundances, and the ability to find and access fruit when it is available is the primary determinant of condition, health, and reproductive success for both males and females. A flanged male who holds a territory that contains good fruiting trees is a male with a resource that other males want. A female who ranges through that territory during a fruiting event is a female with access to food that may determine whether her current infant survives and whether she can invest in the next one. The competition for these resources is the engine behind the behavioral diversity of male orangutan strategies, from the long call to the flanges to the forced copulation. Each strategy is an answer to the same question. In a forest where the resources that matter for reproduction are limited and unevenly distributed, how does a male orangutan get access to what he needs? The rate at which forced copulation occurs in orangutan populations varies significantly between sites and between studies, and the variation itself is informative. Populations with higher flanged male density show lower rates of forced copulation by unflanged males, which makes sense within the framework of the two strategies. When there are more flanged males available to females, there are fewer opportunities for unflanged males to access females without competition. And the female's ability to seek out a preferred flanged male is greater. Populations in degraded or fragmented habitat, where population densities are lower and the social landscape is less stable, show different patterns, partly because the conditions that produce flanged males are disrupted, and partly because the female distribution is affected by habitat quality in ways that change the competitive dynamics between males. The violence, in other words, is not a fixed quantity. It is responsive to the social and ecological conditions that produce it, which is exactly what you would expect from a strategy that has been shaped by natural selection to maximize reproductive success under varying conditions. The intelligence of the orangutan, which is substantial and which has been documented in detail through decades of research in both captive and wild populations, exists alongside its violence in a way that parallels what the first part described in chimpanzees. Orangutans use tools in the wild, make simple tools from available materials, and have cultural traditions of tool use that vary between populations in ways consistent with social transmission. They solve complex multi-step problems in laboratory settings. They demonstrate planning by carrying tools to locations where they will be needed before the need arises. They have passed the mirror self-recognition test. The intelligence that produces these behaviors is the same intelligence that the unflanged male deploys in tracking female locations and reproductive states across a large range, that the flanged male uses to manage his territorial boundaries and his relations with rival males, and that both use to navigate the social complexity of a world in which every other orangutan is simultaneously a resource, a competitor, and a potential threat. Intelligence and aggression are not in tension in the orangutan any more than they are in the chimpanzee. They are expressions of the same cognitive system. The relationship between orangutan violence and the specific ecology of the forests they inhabit is worth examining in more detail because it helps explain why orangutan aggression takes such a different form from chimpanzee aggression despite the two species' common ancestry. The Bornean and Sumatran rainforests are characterized by mast fruiting, a pattern in which most of the fruit-producing trees in a large area fruit simultaneously at irregular intervals, separated by long periods of scarcity. This pattern of feast and famine creates a boom-bust resource dynamic that shapes animal behavior in distinctive ways. During mast fruiting events, food is briefly abundant everywhere, which reduces the value of defending any particular territory against competitors and increases the density of animals in good fruiting patches. During the intervening scarcity periods, animals must range widely to find sufficient food, which reduces encounter rates between individuals and makes the sustained social groups that chimpanzees maintain energetically impractical. The orangutan's solitary lifestyle is partly a response to this ecological reality. In an environment where food is scarce and dispersed for most of the year, the social group that chimpanzees maintain is a burden rather than a benefit. The violence that this lifestyle produces, concentrated in the reproductive domain rather than in the territorial raids of social species, is the orangutan's answer to the same competitive pressures that produce different violence in different ecological contexts. The conservation status of orangutans adds a dimension to this story that is not about violence, but that is impossible to ignore. Both orangutan species, the Bornean and the Sumatran, are critically endangered. The populations that researchers study are fragments of what existed before the agricultural expansion, the palm oil industry, and the logging operations that have converted most of the forest those populations depended on. The violence and the reproductive strategies described in this part evolved in a forest that no longer mostly exists. The animals living out those strategies today are doing so in patches of habitat that are too small, too isolated, and too degraded to support the population sizes that the strategies were shaped by. The unflanged male pursuing his reproductive strategy in a forest fragment is not in the environment that produced that strategy. He is in the remnant of it. And what that means for the future of the behavior and of the animal that produces it is a question that the trajectory of the habitat does not answer optimistically. The orangutan is the primate that most clearly shows how violence can be embedded in a life that looks, from the outside, like solitude and contemplation. The slowness and the apparent peacefulness of the animal in the canopy is real. The violence in its reproductive biology is also real. Both are true simultaneously, in the same animal, shaped by the same evolutionary history. The next part turns to the gorilla, which has the reputation of being the most dangerous primate, and which is, as we will see, more complicated than that reputation allows. The female orangutan's life history is shaped by the violence of male reproductive competition in ways that go beyond the immediate experience of forced copulation. Female orangutans have the slowest reproductive rate of any non-human primate, with interbirth intervals that can exceed 8 years in some populations. This means that a female who raises a surviving infant is investing more than a third of her potential reproductive lifespan in that single offspring. The consequences of infant loss, whether through infanticide by a rival male or through the energetic costs imposed by forced mating with a male of poor genetic quality, are therefore enormous in a way that has no parallel among more fecund species. A female chimpanzee who loses an infant to infanticide is set back by roughly 2 to 3 years. A female orangutan who loses an infant is set back by potentially 8 years, a time span that represents a significant fraction of her remaining reproductive potential. The stakes of male reproductive violence for female orangutans are, by this measure, among the highest in the primate order. The research on orangutan paternity has produced results that complicate the simple picture in which flanged males are the preferred mates who sire most offspring, and unflanged males are the strategy of last resort whose reproductive contribution is marginal. Long-term genetic studies at several sites have found that unflanged males sire a substantial fraction of offspring in wild populations, in some studies approaching or exceeding 50%. This is higher than the behavioral data on female preference would predict if female choice were the only factor determining paternity, and the discrepancy is explained by the forced copulation behavior. The reproductive success of the unflanged male strategy, measured in actual offspring, is real enough to have maintained the strategy across evolutionary time, and real enough to make the unflanged male not a failure of development, but a genuine alternative strategy that is in evolutionary equilibrium with the flanged male strategy in the populations where both occur. The orangutan's position in the series on primate violence is as the case that most clearly demonstrates that aggression in primates is not limited to the forms it takes in species with complex social groups. The chimpanzee's violence is organized around the group and directed outward at competing groups. The orangutan's violence is organized around individual reproductive competition and directed at females and at rival males in an animal that spends most of its time alone. The two forms are different expressions of the same underlying dynamic, and understanding both is necessary for understanding what aggression in primates actually is, as opposed to what any single species behavior might suggest on its own. The gorilla, which the next part examines, will add a third form to the picture, one that has been most misrepresented in popular understanding, and that turns out to be more complex and, in some of its expressions, more brutal than the reputation for gentleness that the gorilla has acquired would suggest. The specific form that flanged male aggression toward unflanged males takes is worth documenting, because it is one of the mechanisms that maintains the developmental suppression of unflanged males in populations where dominant flanged males are present. When a flanged male encounters an unflanged male, the interaction is typically one-sided. The flanged male charges, chases, or attacks the unflanged male, who retreats rapidly. The unflanged male does not engage in the kind of ritualized display confrontations that flanged males use with each other. He runs. This behavioral asymmetry reflects the reality of the competitive situation in which a fully flanged male with a functioning long call and the body mass advantage that flanging confers has decisive advantages in direct confrontation. The unflanged male's avoidance of flanged males is not cowardice in any meaningful sense. It is an accurate assessment of a competitive situation in which engagement would be costly and retreat is survival. The intelligence that runs the unflanged male's reproductive strategy is the same intelligence that runs his risk assessment, and both reflect the same underlying goal. The tool use that orangutans exhibit in the wild varies between populations in ways that researchers have interpreted as cultural transmission, with different communities using different tools for the same tasks, or using tools for tasks that other communities accomplish without tools. The Sumatran population at Swakbalimbing has been documented using sticks to extract seeds from hard-shelled fruit and to probe for insects in tree cavities, behaviors that the Bornean populations do not show in comparable form despite the physical capability to do so. The cultural distribution of these tool behaviors, present in some populations and absent in others with no ecological explanation for the difference, is evidence of the same social learning mechanism that produces the cultural diversity of chimpanzee behavior. The violence and the tool use share the same social learning system. They are both transmitted through the same channels of observation and practice that cultural knowledge requires in a long-lived, intelligent primate. The slow pace of orangutan life, which is the feature that most strikes a first-time observer, reflects an energy budget that is under chronic pressure in a way that few other primates experience to the same degree. The mass-fruiting ecology that the orangutan inhabits means that for most of the year food is not abundant, and the orangutan's behavioral budget is organized around conserving the energy needed to survive the lean periods. The slow movement, the extended rest periods, the deliberate feeding behavior, these are not the behaviors of an animal that has nothing better to do. They are the behaviors of an animal managing a tight energy budget with the precision that a long life requires. The violence in this animal's life, when it occurs, is therefore also subject to energy constraints. The unflanged male who pursues a female over hundreds of meters of canopy is making an energy investment that has to be weighed against the probability of success and the cost of failure. The flanged male who charges a rival is spending energy that could have been spent finding food. Every act of aggression in the orangutan's life is embedded in this energy economy, and understanding the economy is part of understanding why the violence takes the form it does, at the times it does in the animals that produce it. The orangutan at night, in its sleeping nest high in the canopy, is the solitary animal that the popular image presents. Alone still, the forest moving around it without social obligation or social threat. But the world that surrounds that solitary animal is not socially empty. It is full of the acoustic signals of other orangutans, the long calls of flanged males that carry through the dark, and that every other orangutan within range is processing and responding to. The female who hears a long call from a direction she has not traveled recently is updating her mental map of the male landscape around her, noting the presence and the apparent location of an animal whose proximity matters for both opportunity and risk. The unflanged male who hears the same call is updating his own map, registering a competitor whose location he needs to track to avoid or to exploit the gaps that the flanged male's territory leaves. The apparent solitude of the orangutan life is a solitude of bodies, not of minds. The minds of orangutans are connected to each other through the acoustic landscape of the forest in ways that are continuous and that require the same social tracking capacities that chimpanzee group life demands, just expressed through a different sensory channel over larger distances. The orangutan's violence, taken in full, reveals something about the nature of primate aggression that the chimpanzee case alone could not demonstrate. The chimpanzee's organized intergroup raiding might seem to be a consequence of the chimpanzee's particular social system, its large community size, its fission-fusion dynamics, its territorial imperative. The orangutan has none of these things. It does not have communities or territory in the chimpanzee sense. It does not raid. It does not form alliances. And yet it is violent in a form shaped entirely by its own social system and ecological context, expressing the same fundamental dynamic of reproductive competition through a completely different set of behaviors. The conclusion that emerges from comparing the two is that the violence is not a feature of any particular social system. It is a feature of being a primate, of being an intelligent, long-lived animal competing for limited reproductive resources in a world where other members of your species are simultaneously your most important social partners and your most significant competitors. The form the violence takes is shaped by the context. The underlying driver is the same. The forest that contains the orangutan is vanishing at a rate that makes everything else in this part feel provisional. The violence documented in these pages, the forced copulations, the flanged male confrontations, the infanticides, evolved in a forest that covered most of Borneo and Sumatra, and that supported orangutan populations orders of magnitude larger than what remains. The animals living out these behaviors today are doing so in an archipelago of habitat fragments whose edges are defined by palm oil plantations, logging roads, and agricultural expansion. The ecological conditions that shaped the bimorphism, the long call, the massed fruiting strategy, the energy-conserving pace of orangutan life, these conditions are degraded and in some areas gone. What the orangutan is, behaviorally and physiologically, was built by a world that is mostly not there anymore. Whether enough of it remains for what the orangutan is to continue being transmitted to the next generation is a question that the population projections answer with a pessimism that conservation organizations have been working for decades to counter. The violence in the orangutan's life is real, and it is significant, and it is worth understanding. So is the urgency of the situation that currently surrounds it. The gorilla has a reputation for gentleness that is partly deserved and partly a corrective overcorrection to the monster mythology that preceded it. Before D.N. Fossey spent years in the Virunga volcanoes watching mountain gorillas at close range, the gorilla in Western imagination was something close to a nightmare. Enormous, violent, capable of tearing a person apart without effort, prone to unprovoked aggression. The hunters and explorers who produced those accounts were not entirely inventing things. The gorilla is enormous. Its physical capabilities are real. An adult male silverback that commits to a charge and a contact attack is one of the most physically overwhelming things in the natural world. The mythology was wrong about the frequency and the context, not about the capability. What Fossey and the researchers who followed her documented changed the public picture profoundly, perhaps too profoundly. The image that replaced the monster was the gentle giant, the silverback sitting peacefully while infants climbed over him, the family group resting in a patch of mountain sunlight. The absence of the organized lethal raiding that characterized chimpanzee intergroup relations. Gorillas, the revised picture suggested, were the peaceful cousins, the ones who had figured out a way to be large and powerful without being dangerous to each other. That picture is also incomplete, and the part it leaves out is violent enough that understanding it requires setting aside both the monster mythology and the gentle giant correction, and looking at what gorilla social life actually contains. Subscribe right now if you have not already. Drop a comment telling us where you are in the world and what time it is there. We want to know. The gorilla's social system is built around the silverback, the fully adult male whose silver saddle of hair marks his maturity and whose authority organizes everything else in the family group. A silverback typically leads a group of several adult females, their offspring at various developmental stages, and sometimes one or more younger males who occupy subordinate positions within the group. The silverback's authority is not merely nominal, it is real, and it is enforced, though the enforcement is less visible in routine circumstances than the occasional dramatic display would suggest. Most of the time, the group moves when the silverback decides to move, feeds where he leads them, and organizes its daily life around his presence as the fixed point of the social structure. The violence in gorilla life begins with what happens between silverbacks when their ranges overlap. Gorilla groups are not territorial in the strict sense that chimpanzee communities are territorial, but silverbacks do defend their groups and their ranges against other silverbacks, and these confrontations can be intense. The famous chest beat, which popular understanding has domesticated into a display of excitement or agitation, is in its full context a combat signal, an honest advertisement of the silverback's size and condition that functions partly as a substitute for direct combat and partly as an escalation toward it. Two silverbacks whose ranges overlap will often spend extended periods in acoustic competition, each producing long calls and chest beats that carry information about their size and their willingness to engage. In many cases, this acoustic competition resolves the contest without direct contact. In others, it does not. When two silverbacks meet in direct confrontation, what follows is not the ritualized threat display that popular accounts sometimes suggest is the whole of gorilla combat. It is sometimes a fight, a physical confrontation between animals that can each weigh over 200 kilograms, using the full force of that mass and the musculature that supports it. Silverbacks bite, grapple, and throw each other with a force that produces wounds serious enough to leave the characteristic scars on the faces and bodies of wild silverbacks that researchers have used to identify individuals across years of observation. Males have been killed in these confrontations. The facial and body scars are the record of a life spent in a social system where physical dominance matters and where the cost of losing a dominance contest can be paid in blood. The infanticide that follows a successful takeover of a gorilla group by a new male is one of the most documented and most significant forms of violence in gorilla social life. And it is the behavior that most fundamentally complicates the gentle giant narrative. When a new silverback displaces or kills the previous leader of a group and takes over, he kills the nursing infants in the group. Not all of them in every case, and not always immediately. But the pattern across documented cases is consistent enough to constitute a behavioral rule rather than an aberration. The logic is the same as in chimpanzees. A nursing female cannot conceive. A female whose infant is killed will return to reproductive cycling within months. The new male who kills the infants of his predecessor can begin fathering his own offspring with the females in the group significantly sooner than if the infants had survived. The cost is borne entirely by the females who lose their infants and by the infants themselves. The reproductive benefit accrues entirely to the infanticidal male. The female gorilla's response to this threat reveals both the reality of the danger and the limited tools available to her within the gorilla's social system. Females with nursing infants are known to behave differently towards silverbacks who are not their infant's father, maintaining greater distance, producing alarm calls, and in some cases attempting to flee when such a male approaches. Long-term studies at sites like Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda have documented the specific conditions under which infanticide is more likely, and these include periods of social instability following the death or departure of the group's resident silverback. The female's best protection for her infant is the continued presence and dominance of the male who fathered it. When that protection is removed, her options narrow dramatically. The data on infanticide rates in mountain gorillas suggests that it is not an occasional or rare event, but a significant source of infant mortality. Studies tracking infant survival across multi-year periods have found that infants in groups that experience male takeovers have substantially lower survival rates than infants in stable groups, and that the elevated mortality is concentrated in the period immediately following the takeover. This is not ambient mortality from disease or accident. It is violence directed at specific individuals producing specific outcomes that are predictable from the social conditions that precede them. The solitary males who exist outside established family groups represent another dimension of guerrilla violence that is easy to miss in accounts that focus on the stable family unit. These animals, which researchers call lone males, are silverbacks who either have not yet acquired a group of their own or who have lost their group and not yet established a new one. They range through the mountain forest in a state of social deprivation that the long-term data suggests is genuinely costly in survival terms. Lone males die at higher rates than group males and show behavioral indicators of chronic stress in their interactions with other gorillas. They also represent a persistent threat to established family groups, as lone males regularly attempt to take over established groups by challenging resident silverbacks, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The violence associated with these takeover attempts is among the most intense in the gorilla behavioral repertoire. The blackback males within established groups, the younger adult males who have not yet achieved full silverback status and whose position in the group is subordinate to the dominant silverback, occupy an ambiguous social position that produces its own form of conflict. A blackback who is sexually mature and physically capable, but whose access to females within the group is controlled by the dominant silverback, exists in a state of suppressed competition that can erupt into open conflict when the conditions are right. The dominant silverback manages this tension through a combination of tolerance, in which he allows the blackback to remain in the group and to interact with females in limited ways, and enforcement, in which he intervenes when the blackback's behavior exceeds what he will tolerate. The management is not always successful. Blackbacks have been documented attempting to mate with females while the dominant silverback is occupied elsewhere, and the silverback's response to discovering this, when he does discover it, is vigorous enough to reinforce the hierarchy through physical means. The western lowland gorilla, which is a different species from the mountain gorilla and which lives in the lowland rainforests of Central and Western Africa, presents a somewhat different social picture that adds nuance to the general gorilla aggression story. Western lowland gorillas are found at lower densities than mountain gorillas in a more varied and more fruit-rich environment, and their groups are smaller and less stable. The rates of male-male contest and group takeover attempts documented in western lowland populations are in some studies higher than in mountain gorilla populations, possibly reflecting the different ecological conditions that support different densities of solitary males in the landscape. The violence in western lowland gorilla social life may not be less than in mountain gorillas. It may be less studied, because the dense lowland forest makes observation more difficult, and the populations less accessible for the continuous monitoring that produces the long-term behavioral data. The gorilla's grip strength, which has been measured in controlled settings and estimated from the size and attachment points of the muscles involved, is among the highest of any primate relative to body size. A silverback gorilla that commits its full muscular force to a grip or a push is applying a force that no human strength could resist, and that very few structures would contain. This physical reality is the background against which all gorilla social interactions occur, even the ones that look peaceful from the outside. The infants that play on the silverback's back are doing so at the tolerance of an animal that could kill them with the same ease that it peels a piece of bark. The females that rest near the silverback are resting near an animal that could kill any of them if it chose to. The fact that it almost never does is what the social system is managing, through the combination of the silverback's investment in the group's welfare and the behavioral signals that all group members use to navigate the silverback's authority without triggering its destructive potential. The violence that gorilla life contains is not separate from the peace that gorilla life also contains. They are the same situation, seen from different moments. The comparison between gorilla violence and orangutan violence illuminates something about the relationship between social structure and the form that aggression takes. The orangutan, which is solitary and which cannot rely on coalition support, expresses its aggression primarily in the context of individual reproductive encounters, through the physical capacity of a single male applied directly to a single female or rival. The gorilla, which is organized around the family group and the silverback's authority, expresses its aggression primarily in the context of group competition, through the male's ability to hold his group together and to defend it against the single most significant threat to the group's integrity, which is another male attempting to take it over. In both cases, the violence is reproductive in its ultimate cause and function, but the social structure shapes the form it takes in ways that make the two species look very different in their daily behavior, while sharing the same underlying driver. The intergroup aggression of gorillas, which takes a different form from the chimpanzees' organized raiding, occurs primarily at the level of silverback to silverback contests over females and over ranging access. Gorilla groups that come into contact at the boundaries of their ranges produce confrontations between silverbacks that involve the full acoustic and display repertoire and sometimes physical combat, but that rarely result in the coordinated killing of the other group's members that chimpanzees carry out. Gorillas have been documented killing members of other groups, but the pattern is different. It is typically a consequence of a male takeover attempt or a particularly intense confrontation over a female, not a coordinated raid by a coalition of males moving together toward an organized objective. The form of gorilla intergroup violence reflects the gorilla's social structure, which is organized around individual silverback authority rather than around the coalition of males that makes chimpanzee raiding possible. The specific sequence of events that a gorilla infanticide follows, when it has been documented in sufficient detail, reveals the degree to which the behavior is strategic rather than impulsive. A new male entering an established group does not immediately begin killing infants. The initial period is typically one of social uncertainty, in which the new male is establishing his authority over the group's members and assessing the composition of the group. Infanticides occur after the male has established enough control to carry out the killing without the group immediately fragmenting in response, and they tend to be directed first at the youngest infants, which are the ones whose survival would most delay the mother's return to reproductive cycling. The sequencing is not random. It reflects a behavioral logic that produces the maximum reproductive benefit to the infanticidal male while managing the social costs of the killing within the constraints of his ability to hold the group together. Whether this constitutes planning in any strong cognitive sense is a question the science is careful about. What the behavioral pattern shows is a decision-making process that is sensitive to multiple variables and that produces outcomes consistent with a cost-benefit analysis. The female gorilla's strategic response to infanticide risk has been documented in enough detail at the Virunga sites to constitute a pattern that is worth examining. Females in groups where male tenure is uncertain, where a lone male or a rival silverback has been observed in proximity, show behavioral changes that include increased proximity to the resident silverback, more frequent submission displays directed at him, and in some cases apparent efforts to increase the resident male's investment in the current infant through behaviors that researchers have interpreted as paternity cues. The female is not passive in the face of infanticide risk. She is managing it with the tools available to her in a social system where the silverback's continued motivation to protect the group is the primary variable determining infant survival. The behavioral sophistication involved in navigating this situation in managing a dominant male's behavior through the combined use of social signals, proximity management, and what amounts to strategic relationship maintenance reflects the same cognitive capacity that underlies every other complex behavior documented in this series. The violence that the gorilla does not commit is itself informative. Gorillas do not kill the females whose group they take over. They do not kill the older offspring of their predecessor, at least not systematically. The infanticide is targeted at nursing infants, not at the group's adult members or its older juveniles. This selectivity points to the reproductive logic behind the behavior. The goal is to accelerate the new male's access to reproductive females, not to destroy the group. A male who killed the adult females of a group he had just taken over would have destroyed the very resource he was competing for. The selectivity of gorilla infanticide reflects the evolutionary shaping of the behavior toward the specific outcome that serves the perpetrator's reproductive interests and not a step beyond it. The relationship between the gorilla's physical power and its social violence is one that requires careful attention because it differs from what the physical capabilities alone would suggest. An animal capable of the physical force that a silverback gorilla can produce might be expected to be the most violent primate, the animal that translates the most physical capability into the most harm. What the data shows instead is that physical capability and frequency of violence are not directly proportional, that the gorilla's enormous physical power is mostly held in reserve and expressed in displays and postures that allow social hierarchies to be established and maintained without the constant recourse to contact aggression that smaller, less physically intimidating species might require. The gorilla is violent. It is not across the range of its daily life as continuously and pervasively violent as the chimpanzee. It is violent in specific contexts, around specific triggers, with a threshold that is higher than the chimpanzee's, but that, when crossed, produces consequences proportional to the physical power behind them. The gentle giant that Fossey documented was not an illusion. The afternoon she spent sitting near a silverback who allowed her to groom him, who sat with infants playing around him with the patient tolerance of an animal that has nothing to prove, was real. And the silverback who charges a rival with enough force to be heard from hundreds of meters away, who inflicts wounds that require weeks to heal, who kills the nursing infants of his predecessor, is also real. Both are the gorilla. The gentleness and the violence are not contradictory. They are the same animal operating in different contexts, under different conditions, with the full range of primate behavioral potential expressed as circumstances require. The next part turns to the baboon, which has neither the gentle giant reputation nor the War of the 4 Years mythology. It has something arguably more relentless than either, a social system built on permanent, institutionalized coercion, where the violence never stops being relevant and where the hierarchy is maintained, not by occasional dramatic confrontations, but by the continuous grinding pressure of daily life under a social order that has no mercy for those at the bottom. The long-term data from the Karisoki Research Center in Rwanda, which has been continuously monitoring mountain gorilla groups since Dian Fossey established the station in 1967, contains the most complete record of gorilla violence in the scientific literature. What that record shows, accumulated across more than 50 years of daily observation of identified individuals, is a population in which infanticide is a regular and significant source of infant mortality, in which male-male competition produces serious injuries at a rate that leaves its marks on the bodies of nearly every adult male who reaches middle age, and in which the social stability that characterizes the peaceful hours is purchased at the cost of constant vigilance against the conditions that would destabilize it. The Karisoki data has been cited in hundreds of scientific papers on primate aggression, social organization, and reproductive competition. What it documents is not the monster and not the gentle giant. It is the gorilla. The silverback's daily behavior, in a stable group, organizes itself around the management of resources and of social relationships in ways that are less visible than the dramatic confrontations that punctuate his life, but that are equally important for understanding what his role in the group requires. He decides when the group moves and where it feeds. He intervenes in conflicts between group members, particularly those involving juveniles, with a consistency that researchers have described as serving a protective function for lower-ranking individuals. He maintains proximity to females with dependent infants during periods of potential threat. He performs the morning chest beat that announces his presence to other males in the area, and that functions as a daily renegotiation of the acoustic landscape of male dominance in his range. These behaviors are not decorative. They are the ongoing operational cost of holding a group together in an environment where other males are continuously assessing the opportunity to take it. The Dian Fossey story itself, which ended with her murder in 1985, almost certainly by poachers whose operations she had worked to stop, adds a dimension to the gorilla story that is not about gorilla violence, but that is inseparable from any honest account of what happened in the Virunga Mountains. Fossey's work documented the gorilla's social life in detail that changed what the world knew about these animals. It also brought her into direct conflict with the human violence that was threatening the gorilla population through poaching, and the violence of that conflict eventually killed her. The gorilla that she documented as capable of peaceful family life and as capable of the violence the data required her to record was also the animal whose survival she died trying to protect. The gorilla violence and the human violence that surrounds it are not separate stories. They have been entangled since the first researcher entered the Virunga forest to find out what was actually there. The question of whether gorilla aggression is increasing or decreasing as a consequence of habitat pressure is one that the available data addresses only partially. Mountain gorilla populations have been growing slowly in recent decades due to intensive conservation intervention, and the growing population means more groups, more range overlap, and more opportunities for the silverback contests and infanticide events that occur at group boundaries and during takeover attempts. Whether the rate of violence per individual has changed is harder to determine from the existing data. What can be said is that the conservation success that has increased mountain gorilla numbers has also, necessarily, increased the frequency of the social events, both competitive and violent, that occur as the population becomes denser. Conservation does not eliminate the violence in gorilla social life. It preserves the conditions for it, along with the conditions for everything else. The gorilla's position in the primate violence series is as the case that most directly addresses the relationship between physical power and social aggression. Among the great apes, the gorilla is the largest and physically the most powerful. It is not the most violent in terms of frequency of lethal intergroup raiding. The relationship between physical power and violence is not linear. What determines the form and frequency of primate aggression is the social system, not the physical capability in isolation. The gorilla's social system, organized around the individual silverback's authority and the family group's cohesion, produces specific forms of violence in specific contexts. Male-male contests at group boundaries, infanticide during takeovers, and the chronic enforcement of dominance within the group. These forms are real, and they are significant. They are not the same as the chimpanzee's coordinated lethal raiding. They do not need to be. They are the gorilla's answer to the same question that every primate faces: how to compete for limited reproductive resources in a social world where physical violence is always available as an option, even when it is not the first one used. What the three parts of this series have established so far is a picture of primate aggression as a phenomenon that takes radically different forms across closely related species, shaped by different social systems and different ecological pressures, but driven in every case by the same fundamental dynamic. Chimpanzees raid and kill neighbors in organized coalitions. Orangutans engage in sexual coercion and individual male contests over widely distributed females. Gorillas fight for control of family groups and kill the infants of predecessors to accelerate their own reproduction. Each form is an expression of the same underlying competition for reproductive resources, expressed through the cognitive architecture of a large-brained social primate. The baboon, which the final part examines, will add the case that makes the series complete. The animal that lives under a level of social coercion so constant and so pervasive that the violence is not episodic, but ambient, woven into every hour of every day, in a way that makes the dramatic confrontations of the other species look, by comparison, like interruptions of a more peaceful baseline. The infant gorilla's experience of the violence in its social world begins early and in ways that shape its development before it is old enough to understand what is shaping it. An infant born into a stable group with a strong resident silverback grows up in an environment of relative security where the presence of the dominant male provides protection and where the social world is organized around a fixed hierarchy whose rules are consistent enough to be learned. An infant born into a group that undergoes a male takeover in its early life experiences something different: the killing of siblings or half-siblings, a period of social instability in which the group's structure is disrupted, and the behavioral rules that governed it are being renegotiated under new management, and the adjustment to a new dominant male whose relationship to the infant is not the protective one that its fathers would have been. The long-term consequences of early social instability for primate development are documented across species, and the gorilla is no exception. The violence of the gorilla's social world falls differently on different individuals, depending on when in their development it occurs and what form it takes when it arrives. The mountain gorilla of the Virunga is an animal at the intersection of extraordinary biology and extraordinary circumstance. It is a species that has been studied more intensively than almost any other large primate. That has been the subject of one of the most famous conservation stories of the 20th century, and that continues to live in a landscape shaped by the violence of both its own social system and the human conflicts that have periodically engulfed the region around it. The armed conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo that have disrupted the gorilla's range and complicated the work of its protectors for decades are a form of primate violence operating at a scale and with a destructive capacity that the gorilla's own social violence does not approach. The gorilla lives inside human violence as well as inside its own. The two are different. They share a planet. The chest beat that a silverback produces at dawn, alone at the edge of the forest before the group begins to move, is a sound that carries everything described in this part without requiring any of it to be visible to the people who hear it. The sound says, "I am here. I am this large. This range is mine and this group is mine, and the cost of challenging either is proportional to what you are hearing." Other silverbacks within range hear it and update their maps of the social landscape accordingly. Females within the group hear it and move toward the sound, orienting themselves around the male whose authority organizes their day. Younger animals hear it and learn, through the repetition of every dawn across years of development, what authority sounds like and what it requires of the animals in its presence. The violence of gorilla social life does not always look like violence from the outside. Sometimes it sounds like a sound at dawn, resonant and low, carrying through the mountain mist before the day has started and the world can see what it contains. What the gorilla contributes to the series on primate violence is the case that most clearly demonstrates that the size and the physical capability of an animal are not the primary determinants of how its aggression is organized or how frequently it occurs. The gorilla is the largest and most powerful primate. It is not the one that kills most often in intergroup violence, that maintains the most continuous hierarchical enforcement, or that shows the highest rates of within-group aggression in daily behavioral observation. Its violence is real, concentrated in specific contexts, and severe when it occurs. But it is not the baseline condition of gorilla life in the way that the chimpanzee's social competition is the baseline condition of chimpanzee life. The gorilla has found a way to be very large, very powerful, and relatively restrained in the routine expression of that power, holding it in reserve for the situations where it matters most. That restraint is not innocence. It is strategy, and the situations where it breaks down, the takeover, the infanticide, the silverback confrontation that goes past display into contact, are the situations that make the strategy visible for what it is. The gentle giant that Fosse introduced to the world was not wrong. The gorilla is capable of the gentleness she documented, and the scenes she filmed and described of silverbacks tolerating infant play and family groups resting in afternoon stillness are real expressions of what gorilla life contains. What the full record of gorilla research adds to her portrait is not a correction, but a completion. The gentleness and the violence are not alternatives. They are the same animal in different moments, under different conditions, with the full range of primate behavioral potential available and expressed as the social situation calls for it. The gorilla is gentle when gentleness serves it. It is violent when violence serves it. The intelligence that decides which moment calls for which response is the same intelligence in both cases. And that intelligence, running its calculations in the mountain mist of the Virunga or the lowland forest of Cameroon, has been doing this for longer than any human tradition of observing it has existed to take note. The baboon does not have a mythology. It does not have the War of the 4 Years or the gentle giant revision or the solitary philosopher of the canopy. What it has is a reputation for being common, adaptable, and aggressive, and that reputation, for once, is accurate in all three of its parts. The baboon is the primate that most people in sub-Saharan Africa have actually encountered, the animal that raids crops and garbage and campsites, that sits in large noisy groups on rocky outcrops and roadsides, that makes itself impossible to ignore in the landscapes it occupies. It is not charismatic in the way that the great apes are charismatic, It does not carry the weight of evolutionary proximity to humans that the chimpanzee carries. And yet the baboon social system, when you look at it in detail, is one of the most important cases in the study of primate aggression, because it shows what organized social coercion looks like when it is not episodic but continuous, not punctuated by dramatic events, but present in every interaction of every day. The baboon troop can number over 100 individuals. It moves as a unit through a landscape that includes savanna, woodland, and the margins of agricultural areas, covering several kilometers a day in a social formation that is never random and that reflects the hierarchy of the group in the spatial arrangement of its members. High-ranking individuals occupy the center of the formation, where predation risk is lowest and where the best food resources are most accessible. Low-ranking individuals travel on the periphery, where predator encounters are more likely and where the food that the high-ranking animals have passed over is what remains. The hierarchy is not just a social arrangement, it is a spatial one, and the space you occupy in the formation is the most visible daily expression of where you stand. Subscribe before we go further. Drop a comment right now telling us where in the world you are and what time it is there. We love seeing where these videos reach. The male baboon's rise through the dominance hierarchy is one of the most thoroughly documented competitive processes in primatology, studied at sites including Amboseli in Kenya, the Okavango Delta in Botswana, and Gombe in Tanzania, among many others. A young male baboon grows up in his birth troop, where his mother's rank in the female hierarchy gives him a starting position that his own behavior will then modify upward or downward as he matures. At adolescence, most males emigrate from their birth troop and transfer to a new one, entering it at the bottom of the male hierarchy regardless of what their mother's rank was at home. The process of rising in the hierarchy of the new troop is one that takes years, and that involves a combination of coalition building with other males, contests with rivals, and the accumulation of the social relationships that determine how much support a male can draw on when his position is challenged. The aggression that maintains the baboon hierarchy is not primarily expressed in large, dramatic confrontations. It is expressed in the constant, low-level interactions that make up the texture of daily life in a troop. One male approaching another at a food source and the lower-ranking male yielding without contact. The dominant male displacing a subordinate from a resting spot with a look and a posture. The threat yawn that exposes the canine teeth without requiring them to be used. These small interactions happen dozens of times a day across every dyad in the troop, continuously renegotiating and reinforcing a hierarchy that is never fully settled and that requires constant maintenance to remain stable. The energy cost of this continuous social management is real and is paid by every member of the troop, high-ranking and low-ranking alike, though in very different ways. The canine teeth of the adult male baboon are one of the most formidable weapons carried by any non-human primate. They can reach 5 centimeters in length in large males, longer relative to body size than in any great ape, and their sharpness and the jaw muscles behind them make them capable of inflicting wounds that are serious and sometimes lethal. The threat yawn that displays these teeth is not idle communication. It is a demonstration of a capability that the animal showing it has used before and will use again, and that the animal receiving it has learned to take seriously. The baboon's aggression, when it moves from threat to contact, is not gentle. The wounds inflicted in serious male baboon fights require medical treatment in field research contexts where injured animals are accessible to veterinary care. And in the wild, they leave scars that accumulate on the bodies of dominant males the way the silverback scars accumulate on the gorillas. The female baboon's position in the hierarchy is determined primarily by her birth rank, inherited from her mother in a matrilineal system that is one of the most stable rank transmission mechanisms in the primate order. A female born to a high-ranking mother will be high-ranking. A female born to a low-ranking mother will be low-ranking. The rank is maintained across the female's lifetime with a consistency that decades of research at sites like Amboseli have documented in careful detail. The behavioral expression of female rank is the same as male rank, but lower in its intensity. Displacement at food sources, yields at resting sites, and the specific submissive behaviors that low-ranking females direct at high-ranking ones. The female hierarchy is less dramatic than the male hierarchy, but no less real, and its effects on health and reproduction are documented across the same long-term data sets that have tracked individual animals across generations. The health consequences of low rank in baboons are among the most thoroughly documented examples of how social position translates into physiological outcomes in any primate species, and they are striking enough to have produced a literature that extends beyond primatology into human health research. Low-ranking baboons carry higher baseline cortisol levels, reflecting the chronic stress of living under constant social pressure, with limited ability to control the social environment. They have shorter lifespans. They have lower immune function and higher rates of infectious disease. Their wounds heal more slowly. Their cardiovascular systems show the markers of chronic stress that clinical medicine associates with elevated disease risk in humans. The hierarchy that the chimpanzee or the gorilla enforces through specific dramatic events is enforced in the baboon continuously, and the continuous enforcement produces cumulative physiological damage that is visible in the bodies of low-ranking individuals across their lifetimes. The unusual case documented by Sapolsky in the Masai Mara provides one of the most striking natural experiments in the baboon literature. In the late 1980s, the most aggressive and highest-ranking males of one baboon troop he was studying died from bovine tuberculosis, contracted from infected meat at a garbage dump near a tourist lodge. The males who died were disproportionately the most aggressive members of the troop because they were the ones most likely to displace others from access to the garbage dump food source. What remained after their deaths was a troop with an unusually skewed social composition: fewer high-ranking aggressive males, a higher proportion of affiliative males, and a social culture that had shifted measurably toward lower rates of aggression and higher rates of grooming and social affiliation in the years following the deaths. The shift in social culture persisted for more than a decade after the original event, transmitted not genetically, but through the social learning of new immigrants who joined the troop and adopted its behavioral norms. The baboon social system had produced, by accident and through a disease event that eliminated the most aggressive individuals, a troop that demonstrated that the level of violence in a baboon troop is not fixed by the biology of the species. It is partly a product of the specific social culture of the specific troop, a culture that can be changed by the removal of the individuals who most actively maintain the highest aggression levels. The relationship between baboon rank and reproductive success in females is mediated by the social bonds that females form with each other, and the data on this is among the most compelling in the long-term primate literature. High-ranking females have priority access to food, which produces better nutritional condition, earlier age at first reproduction, shorter interbirth intervals, and higher infant survival rates compared to low-ranking females. These are large effects, but within rank, the quality of a female's social bonds produces additional variance in reproductive success that is not explained by rank alone. A high-ranking female with strong social bonds does better than a high-ranking female with weak social bonds. A low-ranking female with strong social bonds does better than a low-ranking female with weak social bonds. The social relationships that females build and maintain through grooming and alliance are not secondary to the competitive hierarchy. They are a parallel system that operates alongside it and that modulates its effects in ways that matter for survival and reproduction. The role of aggression in baboon inter-troop encounters adds a dimension to the violence picture that within troop studies can underemphasize. When two baboon troops meet at the boundaries of their ranging areas, the encounter involves a complex behavioral negotiation that can include displays, chases, and sometimes direct fighting between adult males. High-ranking males from each troop tend to position themselves at the forefront of these encounters, displaying and threatening toward the males of the opposing troop, and the outcome of the encounter often tracks the relative sizes and compositions of the male coalitions on each side. Troops with more and larger adult males tend to prevail in these contests, gaining access to the disputed area or food resources and displacing the smaller troop. The inter-troop aggression is less lethal than chimpanzee intergroup raiding, and fatalities in these encounters are rare, but the competitive dynamic is real, and has measurable consequences for which troop gains access to the best resources in overlapping ranges. Robert Sapolsky, the Stanford neuroscientist who spent decades studying baboons in the Masai Mara, and who is responsible for some of the most important work on the relationship between social rank and stress physiology, described the baboon troop as a system in which the animals at the top were able to take out their psychological stress on the animals below them. The specific mechanism he documented was one in which dominant males, following their own stressful encounters with rivals, would redirect their aggression onto lower-ranking animals who had played no role in the original conflict and who had no means of defense against it. The redirected aggression was not random. It was directed at animals low enough in the hierarchy that attacking them carried no social cost to the aggressor. It was, in the clearest possible sense, the strong taking out their frustrations on the weak. The coalition behavior of male baboons is one of the most studied examples of strategic alliance formation in non-human primates, and its relationship to violence is direct and central. Male baboons form coalitions with each other to challenge and displace dominant males from consort relationships with estrus females, which are the reproductive interactions through which most conceptions in baboon troops occur. A single male challenging a dominant consort male is unlikely to succeed. Two males challenging together, each able to distract the consort male while the other gains access to the female, succeed at much higher rates. The calculation that each coalition partner makes is not simple. The partner who gains access to the female benefits reproductively from the challenge, while the assisting partner expends effort and risks injury without an immediate reproductive payoff, hoping for reciprocation in future challenges. The tracking of these reciprocal debts across the social network of a baboon troop, and the behavioral evidence that male baboons do track them and do reciprocate preferentially with males who have assisted them in the past, was one of the early pieces of evidence that non-human primates were capable of the kind of reciprocal altruism that evolutionary theory predicted, but had been difficult to document empirically. The females in a baboon troop are not simply passive subjects of male competition. They have their own social relationships that matter enormously for their health and reproductive success, and they maintain those relationships through the same combination of grooming, alliance building, and competitive behavior that characterizes male social management. Female baboons with strong social bonds to other females show measurably better health outcomes, higher infant survival rates, and longer lifespans than females with weaker social networks. The quality of a female baboon's social relationships is one of the strongest predictors of her lifetime reproductive success, which means that the social intelligence required to navigate the female hierarchy and to build and maintain the relationships that matter is not a secondary concern in baboon life. It is primary. The female baboon that is best at managing her social world is the female baboon that leaves the most descendants. The specific research that Sapolsky conducted on baboon stress physiology produced findings that were, when they first appeared in the literature in the 1980s and 1990s, genuinely surprising in their specificity. Dominant males, who have priority access to food and to females, and who are less frequently the targets of aggression from above, show lower resting cortisol levels than subordinate males, all else being equal. But the relationship between rank and stress is not simple. Dominant males who are unstable in their position, whose hierarchy rank is being actively challenged, show cortisol levels as high as or higher than subordinate males. The stress is not simply a function of rank. It is a function of the social situation, of whether your rank is secure or contested, of whether you can predict the social environment around you or whether it is in flux. An animal at the top of a stable hierarchy is physiologically calmer than an animal in the middle of a contested hierarchy. An animal at the bottom of any hierarchy is physiologically stressed. What the baboon data revealed was not just that rank predicts stress, but that the predictability of the social environment is itself a major determinant of physiological well-being, and that the violence that threatens predictability is threatening it through a biological pathway that has consequences that outlast the specific aggressive interaction that produced them. The Amboseli Baboon Project data on lifetime reproductive success revealed a finding that runs counter to the intuitive assumption that dominant males, with their priority access to consort relationships with estrus females, would have substantially higher reproductive success than subordinate males. The actual pattern is more complicated. Dominant males do have higher reproductive success in the short term, in the window of time when their dominance is at its peak. But dominance is not permanent, and the males who achieve the highest lifetime reproductive success are not necessarily the ones who reached the highest rank, but rather the ones who maintained moderate to high rank consistently across the longest period, and who did so while managing their social relationships well enough to avoid the serious injuries that high-stakes dominance contests can produce. The male who rises too fast, who challenges too aggressively, who wins many battles but accumulates serious wounds in the process, may have a shorter reproductive career than the male who rises more slowly and more carefully. The violence that the hierarchy requires is subject to the same cost-benefit logic as every other behavioral strategy in primate social life, and the males who navigate it most successfully are not always the most aggressive. They are the ones who deploy aggression most strategically. The gelada, which is sometimes called the bleeding heart baboon for the red patch on its chest, and which is often grouped loosely with baboons in popular accounts, provides a useful comparison point for understanding what is specific to true baboon social organization and what is more general across papionine primates. Geladas live on the high plateaus of Ethiopia in social units that are larger and differently organized than baboon troops, with a structure that includes one male units, all male groups, and the large herds that these units come together to form. The reproductive competition in geladas is intense, and the violence between males over female groups is documented and real. But the form of male-male competition in geladas is structured differently from baboon competition, more focused on direct takeover of one male units than on coalition-based challenges within a multi-male group. The comparison between geladas and baboons shows how closely related primates in similar ecological zones can develop different social structures with different forms of competitive violence, shaped by the specific pressures of their specific environments. The infant baboon grows up inside the hierarchy from birth, learning its rules through the daily accumulation of interactions that reward some behaviors and punish others, gradually acquiring the social knowledge that will determine its own position and its ability to navigate the troop's social world as it matures. Infant baboons are intensely socially curious, spending large amounts of time observing the social interactions of adults and juveniles around them in ways that researchers have interpreted as social learning, the active acquisition of information about the social environment through observation before the stakes of participation become real. The violence that the troop contains is not hidden from the infant. It is part of the daily environment the infant is learning in, as visible and as formative as any other feature of the world it is growing up to inhabit. The Amboseli Baboon Project, which has been running continuously since 1971 and which has tracked identified individuals across multiple generations, is one of the longest continuous studies of wild mammals anywhere in the world. What 50 years of data from this project have produced is a picture of baboon social life in extraordinary detail, down to the level of individual personality differences that predict behavioral outcomes. The social network structures that determine health and longevity, and the transgenerational transmission of social rank and social behavior from mothers to offspring. The violence in this picture is not dramatic in the way that the Gombe 4 Years' War is dramatic. It is the violence of a system, persistent and pervasive, maintained by the daily behavior of every individual in the troop and producing outcomes that accumulate across lifetimes. The baboon also lives in one of the most dangerous terrestrial environments in Africa, sharing its landscape with lions, leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, and crocodiles. The formation of the troop, with its hierarchical arrangement in space, is partly a defense against these predators. The alarm calls that baboons produce when a predator is detected and the specific vocal signatures that carry information about the type and location of the threat function as an early warning system for the whole troop. The coalition defense that adult males mount when predators threaten is real and is sometimes effective, with groups of males confronting and driving off leopards that have entered the troop's vicinity. The baboon's social organization including its hierarchy and its coalition behavior, evolved in a world where predators were a constant presence, and the troop's ability to function as a collective defense unit was part of the selection pressure that shaped the social system alongside the competitive pressures that the previous paragraphs described. The baboon is the end of the series on primate violence, not because it is the most violent, but because it shows something about primate aggression that the other species, with their more dramatic confrontations, can partially obscure. The chimpanzee raids make the news. The gorilla infanticide makes the documentaries. The orangutan bimorphism makes the journal papers. The baboon sits in the savannah under the afternoon sun, in the same formation it was in this morning and will be in tomorrow, with the same hierarchy maintained by the same continuous pressure. And the low-ranking animal on the periphery is carrying in its body the physiological record of what it means to live under that pressure across a lifetime. The violence that produces that record is not spectacular. It is just there, every day, as reliable and as consequential as anything in the dramatic stories that open and close a series like this one. Tonight, in the Masai Mara, a baboon troop is settling into its sleeping trees. The high-ranking animals climb higher, to the positions with the best sightlines and the lowest predator access. The low-ranking animals take what remains. The hierarchy that organized their day organizes their night. Tomorrow, it will organize their morning again. The chimpanzee that raided a rival group last month, and the gorilla that killed an infant during a takeover last season, and the orangutan flanged male whose long call carried through the dark last night, are all different animals living different lives under the same evolutionary pressure. They are all primates. They are all competing for resources that are limited, in social worlds that require them to negotiate that competition constantly through the cognitive machinery that their shared ancestry with each other and with us produced over tens of millions of years of evolution. The violence is not incidental to that story. It is part of the story. It is part of what we are, in the long shadow of what we came from. Sleep well. The baboon's adaptability to human-modified landscapes, which the first paragraph noted as part of its common reputation, is itself a form of evidence about cognitive flexibility that connects to the aggression story. The troop that raids agricultural fields, that forages at tourist campsites, that moves along roadsides and through village margins, is applying the same coalition structure and the same hierarchical organization to a radically new foraging environment. The dominant males that control access to the most productive human food sources within the troop's range are doing what dominant males do in any resource context, using their competitive advantage to control access to what matters. The human food resources that baboons exploit are not uniformly accessible. They require timing, coordination, and the ability to exploit opportunities when they arise, all of which the baboon social system, for all its violence and coercion, provides. The hierarchy that produces suffering for low-ranking individuals also produces a coordinated group that can respond opportunistically to the novel foraging opportunities that human settlements create. The violence and the adaptive success are products of the same social system. The comparison that the full series has been building toward across 4 primate species with 4 very different social systems and 4 very different forms of aggression points toward a conclusion that is both simple and significant. Primate aggression is not a single thing. It is a family of behaviors produced by the same underlying dynamic, competition for reproductive resources in a social setting, expressed through cognitive systems sophisticated enough to plan, coordinate, and sustain the expression across time. The form the aggression takes is shaped by the social structure, the ecological context, and the specific history of each species. The chimpanzee's organized raiding reflects a social system built around male coalitions competing for territorial resources, in a social group that requires male cooperation for defense. The orangutan's sexual coercion reflects a solitary lifestyle in a massed fruiting environment that makes coalition-based male competition impractical. The gorilla's concentrated violence at takeover reflects a social system organized around individual silverback authority that produces most of its inter-male violence in the context of group leadership transitions. The baboon's chronic hierarchical coercion reflects a large, multi-male, multi-female group living in an open environment where visibility and daily competitive contact between all group members make the continuous enforcement of hierarchy the primary social task. What the series concludes with is not an answer to why primates are so violent, but a more precise version of the question. Primates are not uniformly violent. They have very different rates and forms of violence depending on which primate you are looking at. What they share is the capacity for organized, strategic, cognitively sophisticated aggression directed at other members of their species, and the consistent presence of this capacity across the primate order reflects the consistent presence of the conditions that produce it. Limited reproductive resources, social living that requires ongoing negotiation of competitive relationships, and intelligence sophisticated enough to deploy aggression strategically rather than simply reflexively. The question of why primates are so violent reduces at its core to the question of why social animals with limited reproductive resources and large brains develop competitive behaviors. The answer is that they do not develop them by accident. They develop them because they work. The violence that persists across primate species is violence that has been maintained by natural selection because it has consistently produced, for the animals that deployed it, reproductive outcomes that more peaceful alternatives would not have matched. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It is an accurate one. The baboon at the bottom of the hierarchy, the animal whose physiological profile reflects decades of chronic stress, whose wounds heal slowly because its immune system is suppressed, whose lifespan is shorter than the animals above it, and whose reproductive success is lower, is not simply an unfortunate individual in an otherwise functional system. It is the system's product. The hierarchy that produces the high-ranking animals' advantages also produces the low-ranking animals' disadvantages, and the two are inseparable. This is not a flaw in the baboon social system that evolution has failed to correct. It is a stable equilibrium in which the costs and the benefits are distributed across individuals in ways that have been maintained by selection, because the system as a whole produces more descendants than the alternatives that have been tested against it. What makes this worth dwelling on at the end of a series on primate violence is that the baboon makes the cost visible in a way that the more dramatic violence of the chimpanzee or the gorilla can obscure. The chronic cost of hierarchical coercion is not paid in a single dramatic moment. It is paid in the cortisol level that is slightly too high every morning for 30 years, in the immune response that is slightly too slow every time it is needed, in the cumulative biological debt that a lifetime of subordination writes in the body of the animal that carries it. That is what primate violence includes, beyond the raids and the infanticides and the forced copulations. It includes this: the researchers who have spent careers at these sites, who have known individual baboons across their entire lives, and who have watched the hierarchy work its effects on those individuals from birth to death, describe the experience of the long-term data in ways that parallel what the orca researchers and the elephant researchers and the chimpanzee researchers describe. The animal becomes specific. The data stops being data and starts being the record of a life. The female whose social bonds carried her through years of low rank and whose infants survived at higher rates than the low-ranking females without those bonds. The male who rose through the hierarchy carefully enough to maintain a long career and who sired more offspring across 15 years than the aggressive fast riser who peaked early and was dead at 12. These are not case studies. They are lives, documented with a thoroughness that almost no human life achieves, and the record they produce is the most honest account of what primate social life actually costs and what it actually produces that the science has been able to generate. The 4 species in this series are not a random sample of the primate order. They were chosen because they represent different points in the space of primate social organization, different answers to the question of how to organize competitive social life, and different forms that primate aggression takes as a consequence. But the principle that connects them is constant across the diversity. Primate intelligence, when applied to competition for reproductive resources in a social setting, produces aggression that is organized, sustained, and calibrated to the specific social and ecological context in ways that simple reflex aggression is not. The violence of primates is the violence of animals that think about what they are doing, that remember what worked before, that anticipate what rivals are likely to do, and that coordinate with others to achieve outcomes that no individual could achieve alone. It is, in the most uncomfortable sense of the word, intelligent violence. And it is ours, in ways that the evolutionary record makes impossible to honestly deny.